Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hey, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Grace.
And of course, we are at our third segment today to talk about not Hunger Games, but something more than Hunger Games.
Yes.
Have you watched the movie yet?
Oh, yes, I watched the whole 3 series.
Oh my god, you're such a Hunger Game fan.
I'm not a big fan of Hunger Games, but I love the
But
storyline.
yeah, apparently everyone is like watching it, is like catching up with it. But today, we are talking about life imitates art, something that that inspire people to adopt the Hunger Games salute. And this is actually happening right now in Thailand. It actually had happened even during the second installment of the Hunger Game, the second Hunger Game movie series. But now even because of the third Hunger Game movie, they are actually reviving it again. I see news about people silently protest using their 3 fingers in malls. So that's quite interesting.
It is interesting.
And today we are going to talk to Andrew Marshall. He is the author of A Kingdom in Crisis. If you haven't heard that book before, partly because it is banned, but partly because he has become so popular that it's the number 1 best-selling book in Amazon when it comes to category in Southeast Asia. So, hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. So how do you feel now? Your book is banned.
Well, I'm really against censorship, and I think it can only be a bad thing to ban books. And I think Thailand's crisis can only get better if people talk and debate. So shutting down debate and banning books is not going to help. So in that sense, I was very disappointed they banned it. But on a personal level, it's gotten me a lot of extra attention, and I guess it showed I did my job properly with the book, that it annoyed them enough they wanted to ban it. So personally, I'm fairly pleased it got banned, but I think censorship is a very bad thing in general.
Mm-hmm. So the moment when they ban it, you actually, your book skyrocketed in terms of the ratings.
Yeah, a lot more people bought it. It's quite normal. It's, when people try to ban things, it tends to drive a lot of attention, and more people are interested. So it was selling fairly well before the ban, and then the day of the ban, it was way up the charts on Amazon, and it's still doing pretty well. So yeah, it was good for sales.
So when it comes to the Thai protest, it's still actually very much alive within society, I assume, because with all the militarization in terms of the government institution, even in Thai culture itself, in Thai education, are people still having that anger or that hope within them that democracy will somehow prevail?
Yeah, well, as you know, Thailand is a very divided country, but a lot of people, especially poorer people and younger people, students, were really unhappy about the military coup in May. And a lot of people, when you speak to them privately, are very uneasy with the situation and want to see the end of this military dictatorship. But most Thais, I think, are still quite afraid to protest. And so we haven't seen large-scale protests in Thailand. But what's very interesting, as you mentioned, we've seen especially some brave students doing small peaceful symbolic protests to register their discontent with the military government. And one way they've been doing this is by using the symbolism of the Hunger Games and this 3-fingered salute.
Yep.
So it's a very interesting development.
They were also holding this slogan saying the District Thai.
Yeah, that's right.
District Thai.
Yeah.
They called it District Thai, and it's one of the Thai cinema chains has even stopped showing the movie because they're worried it'll be exploited for political reasons. Other movies are still showing the Hunger Games, but they're kind of watching out for protests.
Yep.
But it's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, it shows how young people can protest peacefully, but at the same time make a point. So the military government is not happy about it at all because they're desperate to project this image that everything's harmonious and everybody agrees with them. And they're very poor about, they don't know how to handle disagreement or debate. So the government got very angry. And I mean, these students have been pulled in for questioning after they protested. Some of them are allegedly going to be expelled from their university, which is really sad because every society needs young people who stand up and question things. And if they do so peacefully, it should be welcomed.
I want to go back in time, back in May when you say it started, the military coup started and people starting to protest against the military. How did they got something as pop culture like Hunger Games to be to integrate it as part of their protests?
It's just, I think that, as in most of Southeast Asia and around the world, US movies are very popular, and the timing was just right. I mean, as you two were discussing at the start of this segment, the Hunger Games movies are very popular right now. I've seen them all. Most people I know have seen them all, and the theme of oppressive government being challenged by brave young people, that was a theme that really resonated with young Thais. And also one of the issues in Thailand is you can't protest too directly. So you have to use symbolism and other things. A lot of the protests have been going on social media and Facebook as well. And people are quite worried that if they, share an explicit attack on the military government, an explicit criticism, they might be jailed. But if they just share, the trailer for the Hunger Games movie, everybody knows what they're talking about. Everybody can draw the parallels with events in Thailand. But it's much harder for the authorities to do something about it. And what we've seen, it's a very clever way of protest, because after the coup, the military banned any political gathering of more than 5 people. You're not supposed to have any kind of protest. And some students actually decided one day back in I think in early June that they would just gather to eat sandwiches together. That's how they described it.
And we actually reported in Duran ASEAN earlier this year that they actually gather together in small groups, not more than 5 definitely, to read 1984.
Exactly.
And apparently the book is banned as well.
They were reading 1984 and they were eating sandwiches. It was a perfectly innocent thing to do. But obviously it was a symbolic protest against the government. So the government was forced to act, it banned people. It said you're not allowed to eat sandwiches with political intent, which is just ridiculous. And so this is why the protests are very clever, because they're not violent. They're not disrupting anybody's life or anybody's business. It's quite cheeky, and it makes military government look rather ridiculous when they start cracking down on Hunger Games salutes and cracking down on sandwich eating and so on. So it's a very brave thing, because these protesters, they do face serious consequences, but they're protesting in a way that doesn't harm anyone, and they're getting their point across really well.
For the military government right now, they are not banning the Hunger Games, right? It's just selective cinemas that are choosing not to show it.
That's right. I mean, a lot of businesses in Thailand are terribly worried about any risk of appearing to cause problems. So I think one of the major cinema chains have decided not to show Hunger Games because they were just worried that it would be used by protesters. But other cinemas are showing it. So it hasn't been banned completely.
So whenever the movie is on show, would there be any plainclothes police or even police itself just guarding the surrounding area?
At some showings, I'm sure there will be, and especially at the early showings, there was a police presence. It was the same during another cinema story a few months ago when the military gave everybody free screenings of an old historical movie showing the Thais beating the Burmese hundreds of years ago. So it was a patriotic movie. The military government gave free tickets away to Thais. But then they had police around the cinemas because they were worried that people as a protest might rip up their tickets or walk out. So they had police to make sure people weren't walking out of the movie. And I think we can be sure that there will be some police presence around cinemas, especially in Bangkok and some of the other major towns, when the movie is being shown, when the Hunger Games is being shown. And again, it's just rather ridiculous. It shows, the tenuous grip the military dictatorship has. And and how ludicrous they've become when, you have to have police guarding cinemas. It's, to stop people making a peaceful protest.
When Hunger Games first started, it carried a message that is about oppressive government, and it's about dividing people into different social classes, and to distract society into having a game. It's called Hunger Game, where the main, in order for them for society that of the lower class to not protest against society from the higher class, they create this game where people just focus too much on that particular reality TV show. Would that be the case in Thailand, where the government is trying to distract society with reality shows, with something that is not about them?
Well, I mean, what the military government tried to do, which is also slightly ridiculous, is they had this so-called campaign to return happiness to the people. So the main dictator, General Prayut Chan-o-cha, he's allegedly written the lyrics to a song that all school children have to sing every day, which is about how the military is restoring happiness to the Thai people after years of unhappiness and division. And there's been various events. There's been free haircuts. There's been free movies, as I've mentioned.
Oh, free football shows.
Yeah, they had free football during the World Cup. They have special events around the country where military bands sing, and they have scantily clad female dancers and so on. So, they're trying, unlike in the Hunger Games, where it's an actual violent game, the Thai military's been trying to distract people largely through propaganda and through this ridiculous happiness campaign. And they're trying to create this idea that there's no debate in society, there's no real dissent, and everybody's happy and contented, which is just ridiculous. But it shows this kind of old military style mindset of the junta. They can't handle, having a society in which things are discussed openly and debated. They have to have everybody rigidly adhering to, their rules and praising what they've done. And so it just ends up making them look actually weaker and actually look stupid because they can't handle debate.
What's interesting about this movie, Hunger Game, is that after all the story that Arlene mentioned, this girl, Katniss, she's becoming very rebellious against the government, and then that's when she steps forward, and then she actually starts this whole movement among with her peers, family, all these people, and then that's when the people also get influenced by her movement, you see, and then the Thai people, of course, in Thailand, they can actually relate this themselves to this movie, the whole storyline, how Katniss is moving towards the government. But then I'm very curious here that how is the Thai government controlling the media in general? Because they did mention that we do not limit media freedom, but the freedom must be within limits. So what is your say in this? Exactly.
It's a difficult situation. The media has never been fully free in Thailand because of the lèse-majesté law, which we spoke about when I last was on this show. This law bans anybody talking about the royal family, talking honestly about the royal family and their role in politics. And so it's always been very constrained what people can say in Thailand. That goes for the international media and the local media. But since the coup, it's become even worse. The junta has threatened journalists several times. A few leading journalists were actually detained for several days and forced to sign pieces of paper promising that they won't do any critical reporting. We've actually seen that some of the local Thai media have actually been doing much better than they were. I think the coup woke them up, and many of the media that had become rather nonchalant about freedom of speech and had stopped really fighting for freedom of speech, they've been pressing a bit harder. So we do see stories about corruption within the junta, and they also report on these protests as well. So that's, another useful thing about these protests. Not only do the protests themselves, make a stand against the junta, but then the media picks it up, it gets shared on social media, and so it amplifies the effect. So I think the Thai media is starting to fight, most of them, and they are starting to challenge the junta, but they're limited in how far they can go.
So when they report news that might be at risk with the military junta, how would they maybe do it differently?
Well, what they have to do is just stick to, reporting on facts, and they can't really go into too much opinion about what the junta's doing wrong. But it's very hard for the military government to ban them from reporting simple facts about protests or about alleged corruption within the government and so on. So that's what they've been doing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I want to highlight about the Hunger Games that I find it fascinating is the kind of social class divide. As you all know, Thailand, just like any other Southeast Asian countries, we suffer from high inequality between social classes, and Thailand is one of the worst, in fact.
Exactly.
So has the inequality within the nation itself actually strengthened the military strength or position?
Well, I think in Thailand, as you say, it's a very unequal country, and an elite, a small elite, has dominated the country for Thailand's modern history. And when there was pressure for more democracy, that was when the elite started launching protests or launching military crackdowns. Because in democracy in Thailand, the poor have the balance of power, and they were voting for Thaksin Shinawatra because he's, a hero for many of the poor in northeastern Thailand. And this is why the elite are so uncomfortable with democracy. So, I think the political turmoil that we've seen in Thailand over the past decade is a direct consequence of inequality in Thailand, and also the determination by the elite that they want to keep power to themselves and they don't want the people to have a say. There's a lot of parallels with the Hunger Games, including, this high level of inequality, and, the capital city where there's plenty of rich people, is very like Bangkok. And then you have the provinces where people are poor and people are being oppressed.
Mm-hmm. And right now, are there pockets of strong movement? I know there are a lot of silent protests using pop culture like Hunger Games, but are there any strong movement against the military, or at least against the right to protest?
There's nothing really open, and most of the protests that we've seen since the coup have been by young students. But privately, especially in the north and northeast of the country, there's huge unhappiness about the coup, and people are very angry about it. They're very bitter about having democracy taken away again and again. But they don't feel at the moment that it's time to rise up. And the old red shirt movement, which used to be supportive of Thaksin, the exiled former prime minister, it's been very quiet. It hasn't tried to lead protests against the coup. And sources within the Red movement tell me that they're just waiting because they don't think it's time yet. They think the military government will start to make more and more mistakes and become more and more unpopular, and then it might be a time for a wider uprising. But at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of open protest. It's really quite small but symbolic and clever protests by the students.
Mm-hmm. We will take a short break. When we return, we will discuss more about Hunger Games and, of course, the protests in Thailand.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hey, this is Arlene. We are back again.
Welcome back. This is Grace.
And of course, we have Andrew Marshall here with us to discuss about the latest installment of Hunger Games as well as Thai protests. Mm-hmm. With the latest installment of Hunger Games, you said you watched it before. So what do you think of the third Hunger Games?
I mean, I'm a big fan of all the movies. I preferred the first one most of all. But I think they're all very entertaining. So
for sure, yes,
quite exciting, and also the fact that it's I can even claim I'm watching them for my work, because if I want to understand Thailand properly, I have to keep up with all the pop culture sources for Thai protest. So I enjoyed them a lot, and I'm looking forward to the final one.
The success of Hunger Games, especially the popularity of Hunger Games in Thailand, probably does it show that a lot of these protests that is happening or is silently happening in Thailand are by young people and not so much by the older ones?
Exactly. I mean, all the protests we've seen, almost all the protests we've seen against the military junta have been by students and younger people. And it's a phenomenon that I think you can see elsewhere in Thailand. The best source of kind of anti-dictatorship information and gossip and so on in Thailand is social media, Facebook especially. Lots of young Thais go on Facebook. Often they disguise their names so they can't get caught, and they're sharing information. There's lots of different Facebook pages where they share cartoons and mockery of the military government. So we are seeing, a lot of a very young people's movement. That doesn't mean that older people are happy about what's happening. A lot of them are angry, but younger people are able to use social media and able to plan these protests. So they're taking the lead.
Mm-hmm. In general, what do the people, especially the younger generation, view General Prayut Chan-o-cha, since he's now, the Prime Minister of Thailand?
Well, I mean, the military junta are really from a past era. They're almost like dinosaurs. When you see them appearing on television to give a talk, it's just like something from the 1960s. You can see all these men with neatly combed hair and uniforms and so on, talking very stiffly. So, most younger people, not just in Thailand, but everywhere, they find it ridiculous that people can't speak freely, that basic, freedoms are being denied. And, they've grown up in a totally different world from the world of the Cold War and the fight against communism of 30 or 40 years ago, when, people like the military dictators, that was their era. So, for most people, younger people, it's a different world now, and the world has changed. And I think a lot of people in the Thai military, and indeed a lot of people in political classes around the region, they just don't really understand how the world has changed.
And then I have a question where I think the Thai government is definitely facing a new challenge since the Mockingjay is released, because people are saluting with the three-fingered, and it's a sign of resistance borrowed by these opponents. All these things going on. So how does the government treat people? I think that's a new challenge for the government now, because especially young people as well as the older generation, they actually do copy the three-finger salute as well.
No, exactly. I mean, it's a real problem for the government because they hate any protest and they're desperately trying to stop it. But because these protests are so peaceful and seemingly unthreatening, it makes them look very bad when they drag students in and detain them and so on. So that's really part of the point of the protests. I think the protesters are trying to provoke the military dictatorship into acting too heavy-handedly and overreacting, and that will then drive more popular anger against the dictatorship. And if we look in the past, when there were popular uprisings in Thailand against military dictatorships in the past, it was often led by students in the early stages. And what we saw was the military becoming too heavy-handed in its crackdown and going too far, and that angered more ordinary people. So we may see a similar thing happening here if these protests start to spread. At the moment, the military government, they detain students who do these protests. They normally let them go after about a week or so, but they often, interrogate them for a week. They force them to sign a piece of paper saying they won't do any more protests. And some students are actually going to be put on trial for their protests. So they face a big personal cost. But I think what's going to be interesting is looking ahead. If one of the point of these protests is that it makes people less afraid. When they see other people protesting, they become less afraid to protest. And if we see the protests spreading and people starting to lose their fear of the dictatorship, it could reach a stage where, if you have hundreds of people doing a Hunger Games salute in Bangkok or in a Thai city, what are the military going to do? Are they going to arrest all 100 people? They'll face, or even 1,000 people. They'll face a real challenge. They'll face a real challenge. So it's going to be very interesting to see if it carries on and gathers momentum.
And all these silent protesters, they do it via social media. And the social media, it's really hard to control because they will disguise themselves with different names or different pictures, and it's really hard to pick on the social media itself. So I think this is really a new platform, or it's another platform for them to actually voice their opinions.
Exactly. And I mean, the military junta, they're very uncomfortable with Facebook. They even
Exactly.
shut down Facebook
Yeah.
for an hour. Back in May, they shut down Facebook for an hour. They later claimed it was just a technical glitch, but they were proven to be lying. It was an order from them to close down Facebook. They were just testing, but there was so much outrage because for a lot of younger people, if you shut down Facebook, it's like depriving them of oxygen. So,
I mean, they should learn from other prime ministers or president who have successfully used social media to reach out to the younger generation. Probably that would be the wisest choice.
Yeah, absolutely. But they just don't have that mindset. The Thai military and the Thai elite, they have this very rigid mindset where juniors have to obey seniors. And the idea of reaching out to younger people, it's just not in their mindset. It should be, but it's not.
What is actually the kind of cultural norms of the Thai society that, creates this divide between the very rich and the very poor?
Well, there's been many things. Thailand's always been a very hierarchical society. And
feudalistic, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, well, it used to be very feudalistic until quite recent times. I mean, everybody had their own place in the social hierarchy, and even the Thai language. You can't actually talk to a Thai person, or one Thai can't talk to another as an equal, because Thai language always has to identify who's the senior person in any conversation or interaction, and who's the junior person, which is quite interesting. But I don't think it's a natural trait of the Thais to have to live in this kind of deferential hierarchical society. I think it's been imposed over the centuries. And when you look at Thai education, I mean, Thai education is one of the worst in the region, which is surprising because Thailand's its GDP is relatively high for the region, but its education is among the worst. And it's partly because children are taught to lie on the floor, to bow on the floor in front of their teacher. They're taught all this social graces and social deference. They're not taught to ask questions. They're taught just to listen to what they're told and absorb it.
And this year they are starting a campaign to create a moral sort of curriculum for the students, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they're talking about introducing more morality, which basically just means making people more differential, because for the Thai elite, morality means doing what you're told. So it's a quite frustrating situation, and for younger Thais, especially the brighter ones, they get really frustrated by the terrible education system, by the fact that it's frowned on to ask questions and so on. And so we can see all that. That's all part of the social change that's happening in Thailand. That's also fueling these protests because, many young Thais, they're like anybody else in the world. They want to ask questions. They want to challenge old ideas, and they have their own new ideas. And they're very frustrated that they can't in the current climate.
Mm-hmm. I want to put this focus outside of Thailand because, a lot of people have placed concern on this, even the Malaysian government. But it seems like the concern has more been of an expression of words. Even U.S. President Barack Obama has personally expressed concern on the Thai political problem to Prayut Chan-o-cha. Where's the political will among international community, especially regional community in Southeast Asia, towards ensuring, Thailand can have a democracy?
Yeah, it's quite a difficult question because obviously in ASEAN, several countries in ASEAN are not democracies themselves, and so they are not going to start pressing too strongly for democracy in Thailand because then it would get people asking questions about their own power structure. So, that's why we won't see people like Vietnam or Singapore openly pressing Thailand to change. the Western countries have mostly been very negative about the coup, but they're also quite worried about losing influence over Thailand, because Thailand's always been an ally of the West, and they're very worried that it's going to start gravitating more towards China. So I think
sorry, I have to just ask you, when you say they are worried it will gravitate towards China, are you saying that the military government has been rubbing shoulders with China on a lot of issues?
Yeah, they have. They've made a point of being very warm towards the Chinese leadership, and it's quite natural. It makes sense for them, because China provides a model of an authoritarian society, which is managing to survive and coexist with the rest of the world, and so that model is very attractive for the Thai military dictatorship. And they're also, I think, just trying to play China and the West off against each other. They're trying to make sure they don't get serious sanctions from the United States or Europe or Australia by, warning if this happens, they'll start cooperating more with China. Because Thailand, especially militarily, it's always, it's been a big military ally of the United States for decades. And clearly Washington does value that relationship, and they're worried about damaging it.
I'm actually wanting to ask you this for quite some times. I'm not sure whether this news is confirmed or not, but apparently the Thai junta is creating or wanting to create a new constitution for Thailand. Is that true?
Yes,
before next year.
Every time there's a coup in Thailand, and there's been more than a dozen coups in the past 80 years, but every time there's a coup, the constitution gets torn up and a new one gets written. So after we had the coup this year, they have to create a new constitution, and there's a lot of committees drafting that right now. And yeah, they've claimed that we'll see the constitution next year.
I see. The new constitution, how different it would be?
Well, this is a big question that we're all waiting to see. In the opinion of a lot of analysts, including myself, the military government don't really intend to give back power in late next year as they've promised. They want to find a mechanism to hold on to power. And one way they may try and do that, similar to what we see in Singapore, is that they'll have elections, but the elections will be managed in a way that the outcome is already known, and the military can kind of stay on in power by manipulating the electoral process. So one of the key things to look for in the constitution is whether it changes the rule of one person, one vote. The suggestion that some Thais with a degree, for example, might be given extra votes, or if they'll change the constituencies in some way so that Bangkok has much greater weight than the poorer provinces. Or some kind of mechanism that means they can have elections, but elections won't really provide, a popular government. Elections will allow the military to continue behind the scenes. So that's the main thing to look out for when the constitution does get published.
Or they might create something like Hunger Games.
But that will only increase the gap between the government and the public.
Exactly, but they don't understand this logic. They see government as being about keeping order and keeping control, and they don't seem to understand that this anger is building, and sooner or later it might explode.
And that all this newer generation in the future, sooner or later they will be brainwashed by this government. I mean, as much as they will be influenced by this current generation, but the new generation, because of the school system, education especially, most likely there is a chance that they will be brainwashed as well. I mean, don't you think so? With the banning of the books and then the social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's much harder to brainwash people in the 21st century because they have access to social media. It's very hard to stop that. And, people have access to radio and satellite TV and different ideas. So it's getting much harder to brainwash people unless you really turn a country into North Korea and try and shut out all.
Yeah, I was actually relating to that country, sort of, because they've successfully done that to the nation. So
yeah, but you have to kind of hermetically seal the nation from abroad. So it's very hard. So I think actually, it's going to become harder and harder for authoritarian governments to persist, not just in Thailand, but all across the world. I think because information is now more free, even when governments try to block it, it's much harder for them. So I think the long-term trend in Thailand and around the world it must be positive. It must evolve towards greater democracy in the long run. But unfortunately, in the short term, we may see a lot of setbacks.
But don't they concern like all these rules, regulation, even a new constitution would affect the economy of the country?
Well, it has already affected the economy. Growth is very bad this year, and it was damaged by, first of all, by the protests, about a year ago, and then by the coup. But the problem is, in an unequal society, the elite don't really care if the economy is damaged for a year or two, or even several years, because they're focused on maintaining their share of the wealth. So to them, that's more important than the level of growth for the country, is that they maintain their wealth and their power. And
their wealth are mainly from productive economy activity.
Yeah, well, I mean, most of them have inherited wealth or have amassed a lot of wealth during their career, and they're also in positions of power that allows them to earn a lot of money through their influence and so on. So they're very keen to guard this, and unfortunately, they don't really care if the economy gets damaged, because they would rather have a slower economy, but with them in charge, than a more healthy economy in which they have to share power and they don't have so much influence.
The last time a military government actually drafted a constitution was was in 2008 during the rule of the military.
2007,
in 2007 during the military rule of the Myanmar junta. But it's funny because now the role has reversed. Thailand used to be seen as the more democratic nation in Southeast Asia, but it seems like it's totally going backward, while Myanmar is now opening up.
Forward,
stepping is letting itself, out there.
Yeah, it's a real tragedy. I mean, it's very positive to see what's happening in Myanmar. I mean, Myanmar has a long road ahead, and there's many worrying things we can see there, especially this ethnic and religious violence.
The Rohingya,
is very worrying. Yeah, but still, things have got much better in Myanmar, and it's very, very sad to see Thailand going backwards, as you say. It used to be kind of a beacon for democracy in the region. It seemed that it would left behind the past of military intervention and was building a stable democracy, and that's all just completely fallen apart. And it's a tragedy for Thailand and for the region. Yeah,
it's really sad because just recently in Myanmar, the students made a protest against their education law. So it shows that people are allowed to protest, unlike last time where you can see military guards all over, especially Yangon area.
Yep.
But in terms of the situation in Thailand, do you see a lot of military personnel, guarding key areas within the business district of Bangkok?
Not so much anymore, because the Thai military coups are rarely done with a lot of force. It's often more theatrical. There's a military presence in some parts of town, but really, if you travel to Bangkok, you probably wouldn't notice. You wouldn't know that there'd been a coup just from looking around on the streets. You wouldn't see an extra number of soldiers, really. But there's this atmosphere of fear and of being unable to talk. So I think that's really the biggest noticeable impact if people go there. It's not from what you see on the streets, but it's just the atmosphere is very tense and very oppressive.
So what's the way forward next year? Are we going to see a new constitution? Will there be any protests coming out?
Well, I mean, I think next year or early 2016 should be crucial because the military's promised that it will restore democracy by the end of next year. Now, almost everybody expects that is not going to happen. They'll find excuses to delay. But by 2016, they'll probably have some kind of election just to keep their promise. And as we've discussed, they'll probably try and use the new constitution, to find a way to change the electoral system so that even though there's elections, the same people can still stay in power behind the scenes. Now, at that stage, I think you'll see a lot of popular anger because it will have been obvious to everybody that people were lied to and that the military government never really intended to bring back democracy. And that's when you might start seeing bigger protests on the streets. And that could easily spiral because historically in Thailand, when you get protests on the streets against the military tends to crack down and open fire and behave very stupidly. And that causes more anger. And it's often led to the collapse of military governments that happened back in 1973 and also 1992. So I think, next year and early 2016 could be the turning point. And, I really hope Thailand gets democracy back. I hope it doesn't happen with too much bloodshed, although sadly it might. But yeah, the next year and a half will be crucial.
So will you be coming to Malaysia to promote your book?
I'd love to come to Malaysia, actually. So I've got no plans at the moment. But if I'm coming to KL, I'll definitely let you know. It'd be fun to go. I haven't been for a couple of years, so it'd be good to see Malaysia again.
Probably the Thai people will be coming to Malaysia just to listen to you talking about your book.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Or they can listen to Durian ASEAN radios.
Oh, there's another point that I want to make. The director of Hunger Games, when he was shooting this film, it was just when this whole the protesting in Thailand was happening, and then he felt very thrilled and excited at the same time that it actually it comes to reality from the movie and the reality. He was worried, but at the same time he was very, very excited to see this happening actually in the world. It is actually people are doing it against the government.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a bit like the banning of my book. It's good publicity for a movie
exactly,
to have people using it for protests. So I'm sure they're probably worried that it might cause negative consequences in Thailand, but I'm sure they're quite happy about it, that it's being used as a symbol of protest.
So that's all for our show today. Maybe we'll talk more.
Sure,
perhaps the next Hunger Games show.
Yeah, part 2.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.